Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're going back into one of our favorite topics, relatable villains, and today it's the Batman edition. We're talking about the Batman Rogues Gallery and how so many of them often wind up being villains we can deeply relate to. We're talking about the difference between a villain on a personal quest of vengeance versus one to fix society. We're talking about the way gender can play out in how different villains are portrayed. And we're going to talk about this across the Batman spectrum, but with some reference to characters in the new movie, The Batman. We will be not going into too many details, but there will be some spoilers for The Batman, so if you've not had a chance to watch that, go ahead and take a pause. But hopefully that will be out on digital soon. More people will get a chance to watch it. This is not going to be our full review of the movie, but we are going to touch on it a little bit, so just be aware of that. Either way, though, thank you so much for being a part of this, and we'll be right back. Right after this commercial break, we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew, your host. Before we jump into our episode, I want to make a quick announcement. As you all know, I've been experimenting with different ways of, just trying to help pay the bills that are necessary to keep this going. In terms of website, podcasting stuff, making sure I can put food on the table, all that kind of good stuff. And I'm going to put pause on the Patreon for the moment. I think I never really got it off the ground, never really got a chance to kind of find the things that would help make it worth signing up for folks, which is totally fine. I'm glad we have your support in so many other ways. But so Patreon's going to be on hold. I'm going to put that a pause, so we'll stop charging those people who are signed up. Thank you so much for those of you who are. We will still be trying to get you the stuff that we promised, of course. And we will be coming back to Patreon at some point. We're just going to take a break from that and kind of look into some other options of giving you all the content you want and helping us keep the bills paid here. But today we are, as I said, got a really interesting topic that I'm excited about, and we're joined by returning guest Emily Cissell. Emily joined us a couple of months ago to talk about her work as a teacher and how she uses comic books in the classroom. And Emily, as you and I were talking about how to get you on for something else, this idea of the relatable villain was something that I think you brought up. What is it about this topic that interests you?
Well, for one, it's wonderful to be back. I always love getting to go on other podcasts other than just my partners and the one that I run. But I don't know. I've always just been a big fan of villains, even more so than heroes. In terms of like DC, that's really what draws me into anything that is DC content. It's very rarely the heroes for them, but the villains and the way they do their villains is always so well done.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think some of the Marvel stuff that I most love is the stuff that has the best villains. Black Panther with Killmonger,
Yeah.
Daredevil with Luke Cage. Daredevil with Kingpin.
Yeah.
Luke Cage with Cottonmouth and Mariah Dillard. But yeah, overall, I think sometimes the MCU does not quite have the same kind of villain cachet. And so I'm glad we're kind of focusing today a little bit more on DC and especially on Batman. What is it you think about a villain story that makes it so much more interesting to you?
I think, at least for me, it's a lot more relatable than just a hero story, because I don't know what it is exactly about it. I feel like with a lot of heroes, they tend to kind of just put them in the like the good old boys club. Like, Superman comes from, the humblest beginning of working on a farm and then turns into like Mr. Perfect later on.
Right.
And, that just does not appeal to me at all in any way. But, having a villain have to, deal with some kind of mental illness or seeing some kind of injustice happen in the world and then want to do something, generally, at least a lot of really good villains, that's a lot of their origin story, is wanting to do something that's good and then going about it in the worst possible way.
Yeah. I often find in some way, and I want to be very careful here, please don't call the police on either one of us, but in some ways there can be something a little bit cathartic about some villain stories, when it's like, there are times where I see people doing harm in the world, and there's a part of me that's just like, I would just love to just like, do something terrible. And like, I'm not going to do that. I know it's not right. But, when you get to see Poison Ivy, grinding up, CEOs of environmentally unfriendly businesses to feed back to the planet as fertilizer, you're kind of like, yeah, go you. I mean, of course, officer, I would never support that kind of behavior. But like, still, there's a little bit of a catharsis there, of a like, it's the kind of stuff that we would daydream about, never actually want to do because it's wrong. But damn, it would feel so good.
It's like when you see somebody's face and you're like, yeah, that's a punchable face. You're like, yeah, I could just walk up and punch that person. It's so much more relatable in terms of a storyline, and they go about it in the worst possible ways, but at the exact same time, you're kind of like, well, was it the worst possible way to go about it? Because it got the job done, and it just brings up great discussions to be had.
Did you see the Supergirl TV show?
I have.
So I don't know if you remember this, but one of my I don't love that story overall. It's got a white feminism TV show in a lot of ways. But at the end of the first season, the villain has this, mwahaha, evil plan where the plan is to enslave every human on Earth with mind control and force them to radically change the economy to fix global warming within 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember watching, I think we actually got a great episode out of that, and getting to the end of it being like, I don't know actually if I'm against this. Like, I think I should be because free will is good and all that. But, when you look at like the horrible things humanity's doing to this planet, to our economy, to each other, like, I don't know, someone like that coming along and saying, I'm just going to fix it for you. I get why we're supposed to think they're the villain, and I think they probably are. But yeah, I can understand it.
Well, then at the same time, you have to consider, like, what is freedom, what is free will, and then we already regularly take it away from a lot of people who end up being incarcerated.
Right.
Many states are different, but at least, like, in Virginia, if you have committed, like, pretty much any type of federal crime, like, you get your right to vote taken away, and you can't vote in Virginia anymore. And even if it was, like, a dumb mistake you made when you were 18 and you're now, like, 35 and reformed, you can't get it back.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that I often do like about those kind of villains is it feels like often they're holding up a bit of a mirror to us, in the sort of like, well, if all of us go to a 6, but we never really think about it. We never really think about the fact that we're already doing something that, if we really think about it, would make us kind of question it. The villain comes along and goes, well, what if we actually go to a 7 or to an 8 or to a 9? Because the thing is, you're already going to a 6, so why do I bother you? It's like the villain is kind of holding up a mirror to us and saying, if you're so upset about what I'm doing, why aren't you upset about what you're doing yourself?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
And so there's a lot more there that we're going to dive further into, but let me also just ask you this. What is it you think about Batman specifically? I think in DC, Batman, I think, kind of often is referred to as having the best rogues gallery, and I sometimes think that's true. But even beyond that, like, there is, I think, something particular about the Batman villains that often wind up being so relatable. Why do you think that is?
I personally think it's because of the environment that they are coming from, which is Gotham City. And I think that the way they designed Gotham City to be, the way, people grow up there, and the way their policing system works, the government works, all of that, it essentially creates a variety of extremists because you put them in the most extreme, terrible conditions. And when you do that, you're going to get extreme results.
Right.
So I really do think it's just the way they designed their city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's definitely a part of it. And I think it also ties in a lot with Batman's story, because I think one of the other things I think that a good relatable villain should do is just kind of a little bit of a warning to ourselves of, hey, this is the path you could find yourself on if you kind of let yourself indulge too much in the like, oh my God, I'm so angry at everything, I'm so hateful of everything, whatever it is. And here maybe this is my Star Wars love a little bit coming out in terms of the path to the dark side. And one of the reasons why I feel like it is so appropriate for Batman especially is because Superman's the big blue Boy Scout. He's never acting out. He's doing what he wants to protect people, to protect the American way. Big quotation marks around that.
Yeah.
Batman is doing this to work through his trauma of his parents being murdered. And a sense I often get, at least with Batman, is that And I think the Batman the animated series especially shows this with characters like Ace and Harley and others like that. That part of why part of why the Batman Rogues Gallery is so relatable is because Batman himself relates so much to them. Like it strikes me that what he is seeing often is people who, like, he goes partway down a road but is able to stop, and what he's seeing is people who go even further, and so he can really relate to them. Does that kind of make sense to you?
It does, but it also like makes me question, if Batman relates so much to them, why has he not tried to reform them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, it's the same solution every single time for him. He beats them to a pulp of almost death a lot of the times, and then they end up in Arkham Asylum.
Right.
And then they break out, and it happens all over again.
Yeah, you kind of wonder, like, because I think, at least in some portrayals, especially the animated show that I just mentioned, you do get a sense that he does want them to be rehabilitated. And, so that there's some theory, but it often feels like it's kind of like a passing of the buck of, okay, I'll drop them off at Arkham. I'm sure that Hugo Strange guy is going to be totally fine with this. He's going to reform them. And that's when you kind of get into the question of, like, okay, well, why isn't Bruce Wayne paying to actually, like, hire some actual professionals for Arkham or in some other way help to get the city to actually do that kind of rehabilitation and, restorative justice instead of retributive justice?
Yeah, and that's actually, like, we might see that in the sequel, because for the Batman, at least, it almost felt like the whole point of the movie was for him to realize that Bruce Wayne is just as important as Batman to the city of Gotham. Yeah. That's like what that whole point of the movie was. And I'm like, I wonder if we'll start to see him do more things like that, of trying to go more towards restorative justice, or if we're going to continue to see more of the same. Because in my mind, he can relate to them as much as he can, but it also seems very logical that Batman would not think of, hiring more therapists that could work in Arkham Asylum and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was one thing I really loved about this new movie. And again, as I said, we'll have some spoilers. We're not going to go too deep into it. We're going to do a kind of full analysis of it in a later episode, but I will spoil some things. And one of them is that it feels like the movie is leaning towards, I kind of wanted it to be a little more explicit, but there is a character who specifically calls out Bruce Wayne for not doing more to help the city. And we get told that Thomas Wayne was trying to help the city through economic rehabilitation and things like that. So, yeah, I would kind of love it if there is a sequel to Robert Pattinson's Batman, which I'm pretty sure there's going to be, that we get more of Bruce Wayne trying to use the financial resources he has to fix things, instead of it just being Batman punching poor people.
His dad wasn't even it wasn't just economically he was contributing. He was running for mayor. Like, he was actually performing a civic responsibility and, actively putting himself out there to help improve things. Because that's like half of Gotham's problem, is the fact that they always have a really, really crappy mayor.
Right. Yeah, they have a crappy. It's Have you seen The Wire?
I have not.
The Wire is a fantastic TV show. So many good things about it. But one of the things that I love most about it, it's about cops and criminals in Baltimore. But mostly what it's about is about how on both sides there's incredible corruption, there's incredible problems, and there's also good people who are stuck in these horribly corrupt, terrible systems, And that in a lot of ways it's not any individual person, it's the system that's the problem. And it's, and I feel like in some ways Gotham is very much like that. It's not just going to be one good police officer, because the whole system is fundamentally corrupt. And also, I kind of didn't love how pro-cop this movie was in some ways, but that's a whole other story. But yeah, I think that there's really something there to, could Bruce Wayne be trying to fix that side of things, fix the causes. And granted, this is a way in which Batman is a little bit trapped in that, it's a story that was created when we had a fundamentally different sociological understanding of crime than we did today. Because I think today, at least for many of us who understand these things, like there's more of a view of crime is often the symptom, especially the kind of like, poor people who don't have any other options signing up to be a henchman for a Joker or a Riddler or someone like that. That it's often about like they don't have any better economic options. This is all they can do. This is all the possibility they can see. And that in that way, those kind of criminal things are more symptoms than the actual problems. So yeah, I think it would be really great to see a Batman that addresses those things more.
Well, I'm curious because I know they're going to create a Penguin show on HBO Max from
Right.
Colin Farrell's Penguin. And because they kind of went with more of that like 1920s mobster deal with the Penguin, I wonder if we will see some of that from the henchmen, like people signing up to work with the Penguin because they're in debt to somebody, a loan shark, or if they really had no other options but to work for him. That'd be a great thing for them to be able to address in that show in particular.
And that's one area where I was about to mention the Riddler, but then I kind of pulled back on that because while that may be true in other tellings, I thought one of the most interesting things in this movie is that in this, the Riddler doesn't have henchmen who he's paying. He kind of has like, his mob of incel. He has his kind of mob of kind of, radicalized white male, incel type vigilantes.
It reminded me so much about the insurrection and the people trying to take over the Capitol, like watching all those comments come up from his videos and seeing him like create like video content and stuff like that the Riddler was making. It reminded me so much of that particular moment, especially because I live like right next to Washington DC, and we have I have family that works there and stuff like that, and we were witnessing everything. It just reminded me so much of that, and I don't know if necessarily that moment was inspired by that, or if they were inspired by even just other current things between, different political supporters and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's so much there we could dive into. But I want to pull back a little bit and talk about some of the specific villains because, as we said, there's a lot of different ways in which we can relate to some of these villains or not. And I think one of the ones we wanted to start with, and one that I know it's very dear to your heart, is Poison Ivy.
She is.
Tell us a little bit about Poison Ivy and kind of your feelings about that character.
I love Poison Ivy so much. She has not been done justice at all until the Harley Quinn show, in my opinion. And what brought on...
You don't think that Uma Thurman chewing scenery right, left, and center in Batman and Robin was a good portrayal?
No, they just never make her powerful enough. Because she literally is supposed to be just like this unbelievably powerful person. And they always kind of just like play her down. Like in comics and stuff like that, she's crazy powerful. Like so OP compared to others. And Ivy is what actually brought this idea between us because I had just done a lesson with my students on eco-terrorism. And I basically what I do with them is that we watch Batman the Animated Series, the first telling of Poison Ivy, that episode. And then I kind of pull up like some just kind of scenes from various comic strips and stuff like that of Poison Ivy doing all of her different things. And then we talk about, what it is exactly that she's trying to do. Like, what's her point? And her point is that she's an eco-terrorist. She's trying to save the environment and does it by putting people in harm's way, by killing people and corrupting them in different ways. And then we actually end it by talking about other forms of eco-terrorism. So I always throw Thanos up onto the board. And then we talk about how in history, when Poison Ivy was created, it was kind of just like, it was during the really big Greenpeace stuff. That was around the same exact time that Poison Ivy was created. And it was like they were telling everything that Greenpeace was doing in the comics by creating this new character.
And for those who don't know, Greenpeace was a group that got started in I think the 70s, right?
Yeah, 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and that they were doing a lot of pretty radical pro-environmental stuff. And by no means was all of it violent. A lot of it was, but they did a lot of protest, but they did things like having people in areas that were going to be logged. They had people climb up and live in trees that were supposed to be cut down so they couldn't be cut down. And they did kind of some low-level economics, sabotage of companies and stuff like that, as well as a lot of great protesting and education. And I think to a lot of us, myself included, they were doing a lot of pretty awesome work.
Yeah,
but it was definitely they were definitely trying to disrupt the capitalist anti-environment machines instead
Well,
of just like ask them to stop.
they did a lot of stuff like that, but then they even started like there's many tellings of like bombs going off in college campuses, and even like intentionally sinking whaling ships that ultimately
Interesting.
ended up killing, you know, everybody on the ship. Uh, and that's where Greenpeace kind of turned into like, that's when they're like, all right, they're terrorists. You know, you're
Interesting. Yeah.
literally killing people by this point.
I'll say that. I mean, I'm learning something because I'd heard about some things like that. I had no idea that they were connected to Greenpeace, though. Which
Yeah.
is very interesting.
Yeah, they were connected to Greenpeace. By now, the organization's a little less radical, but they're definitely considered that more radical side of things. And they have that really awful history from the 70s. And when all of that was happening, comics are historical artifacts. As things happen, they create new characters and they do retellings of everything. They're very progressive in that way. And so you see characters like that coming up and being created. And like for me, I am probably like my biggest like issues and stuff like that I support are all in the environment. I worked for years as a rock climbing guide and backpacking and all of that type of stuff. And so Poison Ivy was always somebody that was like super relatable because sometimes I do just kind of want to, you know, stick it to all those big CEOs dumping chemicals all over our precious waters and stuff like that. And Poison Ivy is just so cool to see because she's also just like this really great symbol of feminism. Like of being such a strong woman and being completely confident in her body and in who she is as a person and loving the environment. And especially like these newer iterations and as they explored the character more. So, you know, she became an LGBTQIA plus, you know, icon by being bisexual. And she ends up, you know, truly embracing, you know, every type of style of clothing that she can wear, truly just supporting every female that is out there. And she's just this really rad woman that is very difficult to dislike because I can't disagree with everything that she does.
It's so interesting, I think, to look at Poison Ivy, especially in the two on-screen versions we're talking about. Uma Thurman from Batman and Robin versus the animated version from Harley Quinn, in which I'd say really she is as much a star of that show as Harley. It's the kind of Harley Quinn and Ivy show in a lot of ways, because Uma Thurman is like the vampiest vampy femme fatale that has ever fatale the femme, you know? And it's just like, and like, it's, you know, Batman and Robin is very much this kind of like super campy, kind of gay inspired kind of Batman satire, which Joel Schumacher was like very clear about that. That's what he was going for in later interviews. And so in that, like, it's almost like Poison Ivy as kind of a drag idea of femininity, which you can love or you can hate, and that's something, but it's interesting how so everything her character does, it's to help the environment, but it's all about, I have figured out how to use these chemicals to control the hormones of men, and so it's just it's just sex appeal up, down, and sideways. And she looks fantastic doing it, no argument there. But like compare that to Harley Quinn, the Ivy character in Harley Quinn, where, as you said, I mean, she's a very sexy character, she's a very attractive character. But she's not the femme fatale at all. She's really, I always would always describe her as kind of cottagecore in a lot of ways.
She
you know,
is.
she's so in, and she's not trying to play those games. She has a male partner for a lot of it, who she has genuine feelings for, even though he's kind of a dork.
Kite Man. Hell yeah.
She discovers real feelings for Harley, and then feels really torn between the two. At which point, I kind of wish they'd explored polyamory, but that's, you know, maybe a bridge too far for that show. That's fine. But yeah, how do you kind of view, because you talked about her being kind of a feminist icon especially, how do you view those two very different approaches to her sexuality as part of her character?
Yeah, so in terms of like Uma Thurman, it's hard for me to get on board with them using her in the way that they did, especially just because of the time period that movie came out in. And it's kind of hard for me to be like, yeah, they were totally just embracing that a woman can be sexual and it's fine. Because she can be, and Black Widow is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm.
But during that particular time period, it's hard for me because I'm like, were they doing it in that way, or was she actually just like a pair of boobs for guys to stare at the whole time?
Pretty much. Pretty
And
much.
yeah, and so it's very conflicting because I'm like, yeah, she can totally be like that. She can wear skimpy things and it does not matter because, she's a human being and she can wear whatever she wants and be a total amazing person while doing it. Well, amazing in my sense. She's still a villain.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Harley Quinn show is just so cool because, like, she is still, sexy and knows she's beautiful and awesome, but it's not overt in the same way. It's not like, hey, look at this skimpy outfit that she's wearing. It's done in a very different way. It's done in like how powerful she is and her control of her powers, and it's done in her relationships with all the other characters and her
Mm-hmm.
building those good relationships with everybody. Um,
Yeah.
and she's like an icon of like girls supporting girls. Like
Mm-hmm.
any other female out there, she's just like so supportive of them.
Yeah, I think in many ways one of the best things about her character, especially in the Harley Quinn show, a lot of the Harley Quinn show is about Harley getting over Joker. Is about Harley getting over Joker, and this is the complete rejection of the kind of like Jared Leto, isn't it so sexy how Joker and Harley are so into each other. This
Yeah.
is really about, Harley was in this horribly toxic, abusive relationship. And Poison Ivy is very much in that show the person who's trying so hard to pull a Harley out of it, to help her see that. Sometimes in a very supportive way, sometimes in a very kind of kick your ass tough love way, but in a way that feels incredibly relatable.
Yeah, and it's so relatable for females because I think I can't speak for the entire female population, but we've all had some kind of toxic relationship like that, especially with
Mm-hmm.
other males. It may have not been romantic, it may have been familial or friendship wise, but it's kind of watching the show was very almost therapeutic for me personally. Uh
Mm-hmm.
like I was watching Harley and it was almost like at times I would feel embarrassed of myself because I was like, no, I was like Harley at one point like that too. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, no, I should not have been like that. And then having somebody like Poison Ivy just being there for her and being like, no, we've all been there. Like literally all of us have had this happen to us, and kind of just being there to constantly like remind her like, no, you were doing the right thing. Stay away from that person, grow as a person, grow as a human being, and you'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um
Yeah.
yeah.
And so what do you think it is like? So we believe in her politics in a large way. I think at least I certainly do. I think many of us do, in terms of the like, we're killing the environment, this is terrible. What is it then that makes her a villain? What is it that has her cross the line?
I think it's the straight up murder of other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
That's like the like for me that feels like the definitive line that they have crossed there is that they show like she kills other humans to get what she wants. But then there's also, depending on what show you're watching, what iteration she is, sometimes she'll take away that free will we were talking about and that free choice by using her pheromones to corrupt the male brain.
Right.
And so it kind of just depends on what iteration and how powerful they've made her and what her power set exactly is. But it's always some kind of like murdering or taking control of others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, it goes back to that question from before, which I think is one of the most interesting. And I did not like the Eternals movie much, but even that raised it somewhat, which is, and I think Professor X in X-Men does this all the time. Even Obi-Wan Kenobi,
Yeah.
you will not smoke death sticks anymore. You're gonna go home and rethink your choices. Like, there's a very interesting question I think of: is it villain if someone is making poor choices that are hurt? Let me back this up a second. I think it's easy to draw a line and say mind controlling someone into no longer choosing to hurt themselves is kind of problematic. So you're taking away their agency and who gets to decide what's good for them or not. But when someone is making choices that are hurting others, well, if our goal of restorative justice is to help get them to a point where they're not going to choose to hurt others, I can understand the idea of let's just skip the whole 5 years of therapy and go straight to mind control. And I think that's kind of what I love about characters like that is I don't think it's the right thing, But it does make, I have to sort of ask myself, beyond just the knee jerk, no, that's wrong. Why is that wrong? If we know that people are collectively making these choices that are, causing a literal existential threat to humanity and to the planet, so is that, what are the limits and what is or is not allowed to do to force people to change?
And it's the same question that, I hate to always go to Marvel, but that's my first love. A lot of the question that they brought up, every time in Captain America's Civil War, when they talk about the government regulation of superheroes, and that question is like, well, when do we get involved? When do we force our hand and force our power on other people? And so it's just so cool to see that play out in terms of like villains, and then also seeing it among like the heroes as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure, yeah. I also think with Poison Ivy, and I'm curious if you'd agree with this, I think one other way in which she kind of goes a step beyond what most of us would see, like I think what most humans would think of in terms of environmentalism, but not all, is, and I'll just talk about myself here, I think I'd be happy to admit my values of environmentalism are still fairly humanocentric, in that the reason why I think protecting the environment is important, there are other reasons, but particularly is because we are creating an existential threat for ourselves. We are coming closer and closer to, things that are going to severely impact and, end human life in a lot of areas of the world and make human life much more difficult and just completely wreck the world as a livable habitat for humanity.
And Poison Ivy thinks more of like plant life and all that as more sentient beings.
Right, and for her, I think she'd be okay if she doesn't mind that in some ways I kind of feel like if it wasn't that global warming was thought of as bad for the planet, if the result of global warming is mass human extinction, like Poison Ivy's kind of okay with that for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would not disagree with you there, because, in the Harley Quinn show, she literally has a plant that talks. She is Frank.
Right.
like she has gone to that point where like they literally speak to her and she understands plant life and creatures. And she definitely has taken that like extreme step where I'm not going to like totally reject the idea because we don't know everything about science, but generally plants don't speak.
Right.
Yeah, I think she would be like somewhat okay with that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Let's now shift to Catwoman, because Catwoman is another villain who is not always portrayed as relatable, particularly in the comic books. I mean, a lot of times she just, she wants the diamond because the diamond is pretty, or she wants the money that she'll get from selling the diamond. But often there is, and particularly in in both the Batman, both Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman in the Tim Burton movies, and now most recently the Zoe Kravitz Catwoman, there is some element of, righteousness, of she's on a quest. She has and in the most recent movie, it's more about personal revenge. In Michelle Pfeiffer, it's somewhat personal revenge, but it's also a little bit like on behalf of all wronged women. Where do you see her falling as a villain?
It just depends on how they're trying to portray Catwoman, because sometimes she's a villain, but then sometimes she is like an anti-hero, where she actually pairs up with the heroes, a lot of times with Batman, to, help other individuals. And we see her more in that anti-hero role during this movie, where like she definitely still had her villainous tendencies, and Batman had to get her to like back off a little bit, draw her back in. But then at the same time, like she was paired with him, like she was helping him, and there's no doubt about it. Right. And even like before they met up, if I'm not mistaken, like she was doing all that stealing, but it was to help her friend. So they never truly put her as a villain. And that could change because, she always goes back and forth. You never know with her.
Yeah, I feel like she's very much the sort of like chaotic neutral, not evil in any way. Yeah. She's out for herself, but often she's kind of a person who, like, I think one of the things that makes Selina Kyle especially, like in some ways, I find the Selina Kyle Bruce Wayne relationship a lot more interesting than the Batman Catwoman relationship.
Yeah.
And have you seen the TV show Gotham?
I've seen like parts of it. not the whole
Okay.
show.
Because one of the things that they do with her character that I find really interesting is that in that, like, young teenage Selena Kyle and young teenage Bruce Wayne connect with each other. And one of the things that comes up is this sort of idea of that part of why Bruce Wayne can be so kind of morally absolute and, have this like, well, even under the worst circumstances, you should never make this choice, is because he's never going to face the worst circumstances because of all of his privilege. And she's the opposite. She's well, I don't want to steal, but how else am I going to put food on the table? I don't want to be part of a gang, but if I'm not part of a gang that protects me, who's going to protect me? And I really like that part of the Selena Kyle character of the, she's often engaging in criminal behavior, but it's much more out of survival and necessity than it is just like, mwahaha, I want to kill everybody or I want to steal everything.
Oh yeah, she 100% is. And it's interesting because in the Batman, you see Selena for the most part. You don't necessarily see Catwoman. It's a lot of Selena, but then you like never see Bruce Wayne. So you get Selena and Batman, which is an interesting combo between the two of them. When we usually see, Catwoman, Batman, and Selena, Bruce Wayne. And it's a great point to point out the fact that like Batman will never know the worst possible circumstances. It's awful that his, parents were murdered, but like he still is so unbelievably wealthy and he grew up with all of that money. He never grew up, in those worst possible circumstances versus, he has good intentions and he wants to, help all these villains we're talking about, but like he's never experienced what they've experienced. And I feel like a lot of times he never listens to them about what they're experiencing. He kind of just, does his job of taking them to Arkham, and that's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, before we were talking about how, on the one hand, all these criminals like often turn to this because of necessity, because of what else is there to do. Not necessarily just the villains, but their henchmen and all that. I think they're mostly masculine. I think we can identify them as henchmen.
Yeah.
But maybe some more gender equality among hench workers. But kind of the point being that I think you could look at it and go, so it is a sign of Batman's moral character, of Bruce Wayne's moral character, that he never goes that far. But I also think it's his money. I think it's that he never has to worry about putting food on the table and figuring out what will happen next. He has an Alfred in a way that a lot of these others don't, and I think that's. And I will say, kind of what you were saying about Batman Understanding, as far as I can remember, Batman the Animated Series is the only show that's shown some of that. Particularly with the episode with Ace, but also there's a great one with Harley. I think it's called Harley's Bad Day, where it does feel like he has some real empathy for them.
He definitely has, like throughout the ages, he's shown different empathy for them, and I feel like he showed a little bit of empathy this movie, but at the same time, I was like, this dude has like no empathy for Riddler right now.
Yeah.
Like whatsoever, it felt like.
Well, so let's talk about Riddler, because Riddler is a very interesting, like one of the things that I like so much about this movie is that Catwoman and the Riddler are put in a very interesting dichotomy where she is all about this kind of personal quest for vengeance in terms of, who killed her friend and who killed her mother. And it's a little bit about not wanting others to be hurt, but it's really just about her own personal vengeance. She's much more kind of the Punisher than Daredevil,
Agreed.
For example. Whereas Riddler, like, we haven't seen him be personally hurt by this. He has this sort of idea of that the corruption of the city, of the cops and of the people like Bruce Wayne who will let it happen, and the politicians, that's the terrible thing. And so he wants to be this kind of like warrior for justice. What do you kind of feel about the Riddler's character as a relatable villain?
I think it's incredibly relatable. I feel like the Riddler is somebody that just like sat back and watched all of these awful things happen, and he just felt so unbelievably useless. Like he couldn't do anything. And there's so many times in life where I'm just like sitting here and I feel so useless. Like currently with like the Ukraine and Russian everything happening over there, like I have felt so useless. Like I feel like I can't do anything to really help. Like I can donate money, but then I'm also like, I'm a public school teacher. also don't make tons and tons of money to donate.
Right.
And so it's just like, it feels like he was born of like feeling so useless and just watching these terrible things happen, maybe like to his neighbors, maybe to himself, to everybody around him. But then he kind of saw Batman as, and he saw Batman as being a light of hope of like, oh, I could do something too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so highly intelligent that he's able to like mastermind this entire plot.
Yeah, I have such mixed feelings about the Riddler character because, you know, I think you're right. I think his rage and his feelings of powerlessness and his desire to somehow reach out are very relatable. And he also, I think, very clearly represents, like, you know, to me, the Riddler is very much a stand-in of, you know, young white man who gets a hold of a machine gun and goes and mows down people at a gay pride, you know, event or a nightclub or a school or whatever.
Yeah.
Horrific things. And I think, like, I found the Joker movie very hard to watch. I wound up actually not even finishing it because I was so bothered by what to me was kind of somewhat glorifying that kind of position of sort of the angry white man with a gun and fighting back. And I'm not trying to start that debate. Other people see it differently, and I totally understand that. I felt like this movie did something very different, though, because this movie was both showing that the pain he was feeling and the frustration was very real, but then being I didn't for a moment feel any sympathy with his methods or with his, especially once it was no longer directed against the corrupt people.
It was everybody.
Yeah, in some ways, and this will save for the review of the movie. I kind of just really didn't like the third act. I felt like it didn't make any sense for the Riddler character. So it's almost sort of like, I think the Riddler of the first two acts was a great character. I think the Riddler of the third act was kind of a terrible character. But I think if we just kind of focus on those first two acts, like it is, you know, he's the person who's going further and is using his brain to kind of try and outsmart everybody and show off and show that he can do these things. And it's horrible and it's terrible, but I can't just look at him as a mustache twirler, you know? And to me, I think this is where, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of saying a couple things here, and so feel free to respond to all of it. But it's kind of one more point I think that is so important for a relatable villain. What makes me love a relatable villain is if I look at that person and think, on my worst day, I could see myself going down the road that leads to that person, you know? And with the Riddler, I think, especially in those first two acts, less the third act, there is some of that. You know, there is some of that, like, you know, I'm going to draw an odd comparison here. And again, any Secret Service agents listening in, this is 100% hypothesis and flights of fancy that my brain went on when it was reported that a certain political leader from who was not in power at the moment, you know, who had been pretty awful about attitudes about COVID, contracted COVID themselves. Yeah, there was a part of me that kind of didn't hate the idea that he might die of COVID.
Oh, no, I'm going to say I fully was okay with it.
Yeah.
I'm okay with being that terrible person. Like,
right? And I feel like it's not that far, like that's that same path, you know, of like, well, what if I wanted, you know? And yeah, and so I think that's why I loved a character like the Riddler so much, is because, again, first and second act, third act, it's very different, I think. But because he is like, it's that, I know I don't ever want to be that person. I know that like innocent people are being harmed. And even so, like, we should have a system of justice, because without it, it's just chaos and vigilantism and awfulness. But I get where he's coming from.
It really shows the dangerous power of a person behind a keyboard and a screen.
Yes.
You have a person that like is so angry and frustrated that their result is, and they don't show this exactly, but in my mind, the way this went was he didn't actually start by doing anything. He started by going to his computer and vlogging or typing, you know, in Reddit or whatever it is about how frustrated he is. And then all of a sudden you start getting people of a similar mind, but you're all protected by a keyboard and a screen to start with. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting and cool for me to watch this movie, because it's something that I see a lot in the students right now, because for a couple years they've been protected by a keyboard and a screen. It's a lot of smack talk over text and TikTok that results into, like, I'm not even exaggerating, like mass brawls that literally happen in my school.
God.
And it's quite like it literally is already happening and has happened. I mean, that's how the insurrection happened, right? You get a bunch of similarly minded people all across the country. They're all ranting on Facebook or whatever it is, and you start going down that path of being too radical and going too far.
Right.
And you could really see that with the Riddler, and they did not glorify it for a moment. It was obvious how awful he was, and they showed I mean, that was one of the coolest things about the movie, and I see cool in a different way, and that they really showed like what the Riddler did. I mean, like, it wasn't just like a standard killing. Like, Riddler put a statement out there.
Right. And I think you really touched on something so important, because part of what I feel like we're getting at is that there's this huge wide range of relatable villains, you know, because you take someone like Eric Killmonger in Black Panther. I am so very close to thinking he's right, you know, in terms of, like, you know, arming people to fight back against racism. And I think one of the most important parts of the Black Panther movie is that by the end of the movie, Killmonger has won the ideological discussion.
Well, so
like, his actual methods aren't what Black Panther and Wakanda is going to adopt, but the idea that they have to end the isolation is 100% what they adopt.
My problem with the two of them, and I love Black Panther, don't get me wrong, let me start off there. All right, you have Killmonger being that totally radical point of view. You have T'Challa being like, no, we should do what my father did and not, you know, go out into the world and stuff like that and help other Black people. But then you have his love interest, who the entire time has been saying, no, we should help people, but we shouldn't be radical. Like, the whole movie has said this. And then all of a sudden they get to the end and they're like, yeah, Killmonger's right. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, she's been saying it the whole time.
Yeah.
Did nobody hear her?
Yeah. I think that's very fair. And I think the movie at least a little bit acknowledges it, because, like, I think at the end, you know, T'Challa does specifically say, like, he helped, you know, I now realize that you were right, and so now I want you to help me with this. But you're right. There is a definite irony there of it took Killmonger to say it. So, yeah, I totally get that.
I'm like, I get that you may have needed somebody radical, but, like, also at the same time, you know, and I'm a woman, so, like, my first mindset, I'm like, well, is it because she was female that you weren't listening to her voice in this, and you had to hear a male do something radical to understand it? But again, I'm a female, so, like, so many times that literally does happen, and that probably wasn't the intention, because this was a very, very progressive movie that came out.
I mean, I'm down for a comment that Killmonger was mansplaining. You know, better involvement in the world. I think that's one we can go with.
Yeah.
But just pulling it back a bit, where I was going with that was just the idea of, like, I am still rooting for Killmonger, you know, that I don't want his plan, but, like, right up to the end, I'm really close to it. I'm never rooting for the Riddler. It's more that I'm kind of, there's a little bit of sympathy, and there's also a little bit of, I see how you got there, and I wish that steps had been taken to help stop you getting there, you know? And so to me, it's a very different kind of being relatable. Does that kind of make sense?
It's relatable in that, like, it's not the same issue I can get behind, but I can see any one of us going down that path of, it might be a different issue, but, like, going down the path of, you know, the keyboard warrior protected by the screen, gaining the followers, and then something radical happens behind your cause. But the actual cause, not necessarily, but I think, especially just having seen it from all points of view, and again, I'm a teacher, so I'm seeing it from people of all kinds of different stances. I'm seeing it from people who are incredibly liberal and progressive, and people who are more conservative, and every single time they're in the wrong. But I've seen it from all kinds of different issues happening.
Right. Where do you so in this movie, it kind of gives us, as I said, kind of the personal vendetta versus the kind of, like, broader societal change. Do you tend to find one of those two more relatable, or is it really just kind of depending on the character?
I think societal change for me. I think personally, societal change does it more for me than a personal vendetta.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just like, I'm sure if something happened to me or even within my own personal vendettas, I could see myself going, a Catwoman route. Uh, but at the same time, I'm also like, maybe stop being so bitter about it when it's a
Mm-hmm.
personal vendetta. uh,
Yeah, like in a lot of ways, I love the TV show The Punisher but I sort of feel like I disagree with the writers and that I think the Punisher is a villain, not an anti-hero. In part, and I think that's
yeah.
part of it because to me, he's not trying to fix things. Like to me, I think one of the things I love about the Batman character in general is that I feel like there's often this tension between him of does he want to punish the people who killed his parents or does he want to make sure there are no more Bruce Wayne's orphaned his children? And that in theory, most of the time he's leaning to the second, but he's tempted by the first. And so yeah, I think you're right. Like but I don't know because I did find myself rooting for Catwoman. Like when she I feel like gets a lot more information from the bad guys and the mobsters than either Bruce or Gordon does. And when you hear that tape of the horrible thing that happened to her friend, who I think is implied to be her lover, and I wish they just went all the way with that.
They
That's a whole
really
other story.
did. They really did.
I don't want to get there's so much that movie kind of got 90% of the way on and then left on the table, and I was like, just what are you trying to do here? But yeah, so I think I can kind of root for both, but I think you're right in terms of the kind of like overall, I'm probably more on that side like you of the societal change rather than just being about personal vendettas and violence.
Yeah, and because most villains that it's all about a personal vendetta, I don't see myself getting behind. So like Iron Man 2 is if you've never seen Iron Man 2, you should because I think it's decent. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people hate on it, but the villain, his whole point is a personal vendetta against Tony Stark and what happened to his father.
Right.
And like I can never get behind that villain. I'm just like, yeah, you just need to be taken down and go back to jail by this point because
Yeah, there's not. I mean, there's a lot of problems with the second Iron Man movie, but the lack of relatable villains, I think, is definitely one of them.
I'm trying to think of another one that I really just do not relate to at all. I guess Guardians of the Galaxy, like I don't relate to that villain at all. Like Ronan the Accuser is literally just trying to, kill everybody. And that's not even a vendetta.
Right.
He's literally just like, I'm gonna kill everybody and take over the world. Very mustache Troily.
And I do think there's something interesting about how much do we relate to someone. Like I think sometimes the more of someone's backstory I know, the easier it is for me to relate to them. For obvious reasons, because now I understand more of them.
Yeah.
And I do think there's an interesting tension sometimes of, if we had seen a movie about Ronan's world being wiped out,
Yeah.
and the suffering of his family, would we feel differently about him? I think that's you gotta get. I mean, he's a genocidal maniac.
Yeah.
I still think we're probably against him, but I do think there's an interesting idea there of when we see someone who seems like a mustache twirler, how much of it's because we don't know their backstory.
A lot of so when I saw Captain America: Civil War, like when they introduced Zemo, I was just like, oh, Zemo's just a maniac taking over and killing people. But then we got Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and we started getting so much more background information about who Zemo is as a person. And then all of a sudden, I was like, oh, I don't mind Zemo at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's also the dancing and him just being dead sexy. But yes,
Oh,
also
yeah.
the like
I have
the
socks.
suffering.
I have a pair of socks that have him dancing in the club around them.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I love that. All right. Well, we've got about a good hour. There's a lot here to talk about, but we've kind of covered a lot. Is there any kind of last things about this idea of the relatable villain that you wanted to get into, especially in terms of these characters and Batman?
I think it's something really cool that especially a lot of Pixar and Disney movies have started to do is that instead of having just like a general villain, they have actual legitimate problems and issues that they're trying to solve. Like Turning Red, it's, familial between mother and daughter and, growing up and such. And Encanto, it's all of these different family dynamics.
It's generational trauma.
Yeah.
The fact that even by the end, even the grandmother is not, the abuela is not a villain as much as she's a victim who's then passed on her victimization to everyone else.
Exactly. And I think the most relatable villains are the ones that take that concept and they put that concept into a person. And that person represents that type of concept. Because, superhero films, they're always going to have some kind of big bad villain. It's not going to be, the casita is falling apart because, the family is falling apart. That's not ever really going to be a Marvel movie or a DC movie. But putting that type of concept of, generational trauma and impacting that on other people, you can make that a person.
Right.
And then that person is a villain and you can find out about that and you still get that kind of same concept. And it feels like, at least in the past 10 to 20 years, that's more where superhero films are going towards. And it's made the villains way more relatable. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's really true because I think that, like I was talking about The Wire and how part of the point of The Wire is that it's these systems that are the real problem. And in kind of the same way, like, there's always these jokes that you see around about, like, the best way to deal with billionaires is a guillotine and stuff like that. And, like, I'm always, like, again, that's where the villain, there's the part of me that's like, yeah, like, if you are hoarding that much wealth, like, you're an awful, evil person and you're harming people. But also there's, like, even putting aside, like, again, I don't want to be killing anybody, to be absolutely clear. But also there's a sense of, like, it's not the individual if you kill 12 billionaires, all that you get is 12 more billionaires of the people who their money goes to, who are going to be just as bad. Like, the issue is the economic system that allows for people to hoard that much wealth and exploit that many people. The problem is like, sometimes you'll see the same thing. Like, the best way to fix the environment is to, like, arrest the heads of the 12 biggest polluting companies. Well, no, it's not. The company is going to keep just doing what it's doing. And I kind of like this idea. Like, it is very satisfying to have, Captain America punching Hitler is one of the most satisfying images you're ever going to see in comic books or on screen or anything. And Hitler is Nazism was a larger system and was a problematic thing. And anti-Semitism in Germany was way before Hitler and continued way after Hitler. Hitler himself, though, clearly, like, one of the truly awful, evil people of history. But Hitler's the exception. Most of the time it's not a Hitler, it's the system. And yeah, I kind of like that we're getting more villains where they are also trapped in the system and they're making bad choices and so they have to be stopped. But we can also see them as victims in some way.
Yeah, totally agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Emily, so much. It's always great to have you on the podcast. I'm so glad we got to have you back for this topic. I know you've been doing some other stuff. Where can people find more of? I know you've been given, like, some talks, and I think you have some videos. You've also been on some of the other podcasts here on the Stranded Panda Network. Where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, so sometimes I go on Animation Deliberation with Zuhair Ali, so if you want to stay within the Stranded Panda Network. But there's also the 323 Network. That's literally just the numbers. But that is sports. So if you are a sports person, it is absolutely fantastic. My partner, he runs all of that. And then within that network, I run a podcast called Emily Cissell Asks What If, where I take moments in sports history and we talk about them. And then I dissect it down to what if this one little part of that moment in sports history changed and how does that impact society and culture as a whole?
Interesting.
Yeah, so I take the concept of what if from the TV shows and the comics, but I put it in the sports world.
Have you done something about what Boston is like over the last 40 years if the ball doesn't roll through Buckner's legs, or more importantly, if the wild pitch before that didn't happen?
I do things, I could do things like that, like the Black Sox scandal. How things in the Black Sox scandal, if things had gone differently and how they would have impacted, gambling in the United States. I've looked at not Jesse Owens directly, but instead Carl Capardi. I'm mispronouncing his last name now that I'm not thinking of it, but he was the Jewish wrestler that actually competed before Jesse Owens. If it wasn't for him, Jesse Owens never would have taken over for the Jewish runners, that type of stuff.
Right.
So
interesting. That sounds like a great...
doesn't get released as often as I would like because I live that teacher life, which is constant. But it's pretty cool, and the 323 network is great. And then I speak at comic book conventions about how you use comics in the classroom. So
Nice.
I most recently spoke at KatsuCon. I will most likely be at AwesomeCon again in Washington, D.C. I'm just waiting on final approval. And I'm putting in my application for New York Comic Con, so who knows? You might see me there.
Sounds good. We'll definitely do it. And I will say on my own just plugging note, I just finished the book Moneyball after watching the movie. It's one of my favorite part of sports history. So if you ever want to do an episode about that, I'd be happy to come on as a guest because it's such a both the kind of like the economics of sports, but also the like the conflict of the moment when it shifts from being a story of passed down wisdom to a story of actually paying attention to the statistics is, trust the data is kind of an interesting point in our world in general. So
it is.
Yeah, that's a topic I'd love to talk to you about. Well, you can find Emily's earlier episode about teaching with comic books, which is a great one, as well as all the other episodes of this podcast and all my other podcasts by going to theethicalpanda.com. There also you'll find our contact information, all the different ways to contact us, tell us what you love, what you agree with. What do you think of the different versions of Catwoman or Poison Ivy or the Riddler or some of the other things we've talked about? Would love to hear what you have to say. Write into us there. I'll make sure in the show notes are all the things that Emily's up to. Check all that out. And most importantly, have a great day.